It's 9:55, Rome, 3 in the morning. The bells of the Lateran Palace are silent. The city beyond the walls is asleep. But inside those consecrated halls, something is screaming. Not a scream you can hear with your ears, a scream inside the mind of a man barely old enough to grow facial hair, who is supposed to be God's representative on earth. His name is John. He's 18 years old. He is the Pope. Right now, in this moment, he is standing in a marble corridor that stretches into darkness, candles flickering along the walls, and he's staring at his own hands like they belong to someone else. Because they do. They belong to someone else now. Someone he doesn't recognize. Someone who has done things in the past 6 months that should be impossible for a human being to do and still live with themselves. The corridor is cold, stone underneath his feet. His white robes, the robes that mark him as infallible, as God's voice on earth, sweep across the floor as he walks. He hasn't slept. Not really. Not since the dreams started. Dreams where he's standing in front of God, and God is asking him to explain what he's done. And John can't speak, can't form words, can't defend himself, because there is no defense for what he knows he is. But John is learning that the human mind is remarkably good at compartmentalization. You can do unspeakable things during the day and tell yourself it isn't really happening. You can wear white robes and speak blessings, perform ceremonies, and then, when the sun sets, becomes something else entirely, something that even you don't want to name. The palace is vast, filled with echoing chambers, hidden staircases, and frescoed walls that depict saints, martyrs, and the very hand of God touching the faithful. And yet, in these walls, John feels the absence of divinity more than its presence. Every step he takes is heavy with the knowledge of the lives he has altered, the oaths he has violated. He remembers the first time he looked into the eyes of a young nun who had devoted her life to God. She trusted him, she believed in him, and he had betrayed that trust in a way so intimate, so invasive, that even he cannot fully confront it. The nuns are silent now. Their whispers, prayers, and laughter have been replaced by fear and confusion. They wander the halls in a daze, attempting to reconcile the man who blesses them in daylight with the man who stalks shadows at night. Many have taken vows to God that they believe will shield them from earthly sin. Yet the palace itself has become a crucible where innocence is tested, broken, and reshaped. Their spiritual identities, once firm and unshakable, now tremble in the face of John's presence. John's own desires are a labyrinth. At first, he was drawn to the nuns, drawn by curiosity, rebellion, or perhaps the intoxicating taste of power. But then the pattern shifted. He began to take male lovers as well, asserting his influence over anyone he could dominate. The palace whispers with rumors, of course, though chroniclers struggle to describe his actions in language fit for the history books. Gay orgies at the Vatican, secret rooms where pleasure and coercion blend. The mind reels at such contradictions. The supposed moral guardian, the representative of God, indulging in acts so worldly, so human, yet so monstrous. Even the oldest cardinals are unsettled. They watch him, some with fear, others with opportunistic calculation, but none dare intervene. Absolute power has been vested in this boy, and absolute power breeds absolute silence. The hierarchy of the palace does not allow questioning. Every gesture, every command, every glance reinforces the machinery of obedience. Even dissenting whispers are crushed under the weight of tradition, fear, and the unspoken agreement that the institution itself is more important than the conscience of a single individual. In the private chambers, John examines himself in mirrors. The reflection staring back is unfamiliar. The face is youthful, almost innocent, but the eyes, those eyes are aged beyond their years. They have seen fear, pain, shame, and desire intertwined in ways the world outside the walls cannot comprehend. He touches his lips, his hands, as if expecting to find the man he once was hiding beneath the surface. But only the Pope remains, a symbol of absolute authority and unfathomable sin. And yet, for all this darkness, there is structure. The palace has routines. The clockwork of rituals, prayers, and public ceremonies create a veneer of order over the chaos. John performs his duties flawlessly in the presence of others. Morning mass, blessings, audiences with nobles, the careful reading of letters from distant kingdoms, all are executed with precision. But in the empty corridors, when no eyes are upon him, the weight of his actions presses down like a stone. He wonders how long he can maintain the separation between the persona he shows the world and the reality he knows in secret. There are nights when he feels trapped in his own body, a spectator watching himself act out unthinkable deeds. Compartmentalization allows him to survive, but it is not comfort. The human mind, John realizes, can become a weapon against itself, building walls so high that guilt and desire cannot pass. But sometimes, just sometimes, cracks appear, and in those cracks, doubt slithers through. John walks past the private cells of the nuns, hearing the soft rustle of linen, the quiet prayers whispered in the darkness. He remembers their faces, their voices, the first time they looked at him with hope, devotion, trust. He remembers how quickly those eyes clouded with confusion, terror, and disbelief. Every act of manipulation, every coercion, every violation is a mark upon him, though invisible to the world. History may never record it, but it exists, etched into memory, indelibly. And yet, he continues, because the palace allows it. The hierarchy, the system, the unyielding rules that place survival of the institution above all else, these structures enable him. If the machinery of authority were different, if accountability flowed upward, if someone dared to speak truth without fear, perhaps he would be stopped. But that is not the world he inhabits. The walls of the Lateran Palace are more than stone. They are shields, barriers between sin and justice. And inside those walls, the machinery of power hums quietly, consuming everyone in its path. Outside, Rome sleeps, innocent, ignorant, safe behind walls that cannot protect them from history repeating itself inside the palace. Every night, John's deeds ripple outwards, leaving traces that will echo through centuries. The mechanisms of psychological control, coercion, and fear do not vanish. They are studied, refined, applied again and again, long after names are forgotten, long after faces blur into the past. What he learns, consciously or not, is a knowledge that will outlive him. The understanding of how to break a person's will, how to manipulate the mind, how to hide behind ritual while acting without conscience. John moves toward the chapel. Candles gutter in the draught of cold stone. The statues of saints watch, eternal and silent. Here in this sacred space, he can almost pretend there is redemption, almost pretend that God might forgive him if he knew, if he could see. But the truth is heavier than any confessional, more suffocating than any prayer. God does not intervene. The Pope is alone, trapped inside himself, alone with the machinery of his own making. And so he prays, not for forgiveness, not for guidance, but for the continuation of the veil. The silence must remain. The compartments must hold. The world must not see. He prays that the marble corridors will never echo with accusation, that the nuns' voices will remain lost in the dark, and that the machinery of the palace will hum without pause, preserving the institution above all else. Because in the Lateran palace, power is absolute, and accountability flows nowhere.
The palace is alive with secrets. Every corridor, every chamber, every shadowed corner holds a whisper of what has happened and what is still happening. Outside, Rome remains silent, but within the stone walls of the Lateran palace, the consequences of power are immediate, tangible, and inescapable. Here, John's presence alone is a weapon. His influence flows through the hierarchy, through the attendants, the nuns, the guards, and even the cardinals who pretend not to notice. The nuns are the first to feel the weight of his manipulation. They are trained in discipline, prayer, and obedience, yet their spiritual fortresses crumble under the subtle, relentless strategies of a man who knows the human mind better than they know themselves. John does not use force alone. That would be too obvious, too dangerous. Instead, he uses attention, withdrawal, approval, and threat, tools far more potent than chains or walls. A word of praise, a lingering gaze, a subtle smile in the right moment, and the walls of a nun's resolve begin to shift. A frown, a glance of cold indifference, a dismissal, and panic takes root. Each encounter is carefully calculated, though John does not consciously admit it. He experiments, learning which methods produce compliance and which provoke resistance. Isolation is one of his most effective tools. By controlling who speaks to whom, by restricting access to letters, prayers, and visitors, he creates a vacuum. In that vacuum, his influence grows. Every whispered conversation becomes a weapon. Every glance, gesture, and word is part of the machinery. The nuns begin to question themselves. Their faith, their choices, their memories of the world outside. Everything is filtered through the prism of John's authority. But it is not only the nuns who are ensnared. John's own desires expand beyond gender, morality, and tradition. He seeks male companions, using the same methods of coercion and psychological manipulation he perfected with the nuns. The palace, with its hidden chambers and labyrinthine corridors, becomes a stage for acts that are private, secret, and carefully controlled. Rumors circulate in whispers. The oldest chroniclers struggle to categorize these behaviors, labeling them only as disturbing or unholy. The truth is far more complex. Every act of coercion, every seduction, every abuse of trust leaves marks, not on the body, but on the mind. The nuns who once walked in certainty now tread carefully through fear, doubt, and confusion. They are aware that they are being observed, tested, and judged, yet the rules of the palace prevent them from speaking out. The hierarchy itself is designed to absorb and redirect dissent, to reward silence and punish curiosity. Even the most devout cannot escape the subtle pressures of authority. John observes all of this. In his chambers, he reflects on the duality of his existence. By day, he is the Pope, performing ceremonies, blessing the faithful, and maintaining the public image of infallibility. By night, he is the architect of a psychological empire, testing the limits of human obedience and submission. The lessons he learns are darkly universal. Power unopposed always corrupts, and the human mind is surprisingly malleable when placed under pressure. The machinery of the palace ensures that nothing is random. Every element is part of the system. The priests who report directly to him, the attendants who carry his messages, the rules of isolation, the strict hierarchy, the sanctity of the Pope's authority. The system itself becomes an accomplice, making John's actions possible and protecting him from consequence. Even if someone suspects, even if a nun dares to speak out, the institution moves to absorb or dismiss the threat. Survival of the hierarchy is more important than the welfare of the individual. And yet, cracks appear. Some nuns resist. Some find subtle ways to communicate with one another, sharing whispers of comfort and courage. They cling to rituals that John cannot fully control: prayers at dawn, secret notes passed under doors, hymns sung softly when no one is listening. These small acts of rebellion are invisible to the larger system, but they are powerful. They are reminders that while machinery can dominate, it cannot completely erase human will. The psychological toll on John is also visible. He begins to notice the strain of his own compartmentalization. Sleep is elusive, interrupted by dreams of judgment, faces of those he has manipulated, the eyes of God demanding answers. He is haunted by moments of clarity when the full weight of his actions presses down, leaving him unable to move or speak. Compartmentalization can protect the mind, but only temporarily. Eventually, guilt seeps through the cracks. Even his male companions, seduced and coerced, are caught in the same web. They struggle to reconcile affection, fear, desire, and obedience. John's methods are refined, systematic, almost scientific. He tests limits, observes reactions, and adjusts. He does not need physical violence. The mind is enough. Broken spirits, confused loyalties, blurred boundaries, these are the trophies of his mastery. And the palace itself facilitates every step, offering cover, secrecy, and authority that cannot be questioned. Outside the palace, life continues normally. Merchants, pilgrims, and nobles move through the streets of Rome unaware of the shadows cast by the marble walls of the Lateran Palace. Yet even in the silence, the effects ripple outward. The knowledge of how to manipulate, isolate, and dominate lives on, spread by the whispered accounts of those who survived, by the chroniclers who recorded fragments, and eventually by anyone who studies power and control in its most raw, unflinching form. In these halls, John discovers the terrifying truth: human minds can be systematically broken without leaving a single mark. Trust can be dismantled, willpower eroded, identity reshaped. The palace becomes both laboratory and battlefield, where every soul is tested and the machinery of authority is weaponized against those who enter it with devotion and innocence. Yet there is a subtle resistance. In hidden corners, in quiet corners of prayer and whispered solidarity, the victims begin to leave traces of their humanity. Every act of remembrance, every small defiance becomes a thread of hope. The palace may enable abuse, but it cannot erase the essence of the human spirit. And so, the dance continues. John moves, observes, tests, and manipulates. The nuns hide, resist, pray, and endure. The palace maintains its structure, its hierarchy, its sanctity in the eyes of the outside world. And the machinery of power hums, precise and unrelenting, proving that authority unchallenged is a force more dangerous than any weapon. In these halls, John discovers the terrifying truth: human minds can be systematically broken without leaving a single mark. Trust can be dismantled, willpower eroded, identity reshaped. The palace becomes both laboratory and battlefield, where every soul is tested and the machinery of authority is weaponized against those who enter it with devotion and innocence. And so, the dance continues. John moves, observes, tests, and manipulates. The nuns hide, resist, pray, and endure. The palace maintains its structure, its hierarchy, its sanctity in the eyes of the outside world, and the machinery of power hums, precise and unrelenting, proving that authority unchallenged is a force more dangerous than any weapon.
Within these walls, John learns a lesson that history will one day record. Absolute power, when combined with absolute impunity, does not corrupt sometimes,
it inevitably destroys not only the lives of others, but the soul of the one who wields it.
The Lateran Palace, though ancient, seems alive with the whispers of centuries. Its marble walls have witnessed papal coronations, the signing of decrees, and the rise and fall of power. Yet now, the palace is witness to something darker, a corruption not of politics alone, but of morality, faith, and trust. John, barely 18, is not just a young man with power. He is a symbol of everything the church claims to uphold, and his actions are shaking the very foundation of that institution. Medieval chroniclers struggled to record what they saw. How do you describe a pope who betrays his spiritual duties with a deliberate, calculating cruelty? How do you write about a man holding gay orgies in the Vatican while still performing sacred rituals in the daylight? Words fail, and those who attempt to document it often stumble over moral frameworks that simply cannot contain such behavior. They labeled it unholy, disturbing, or abominable. Yet even these words fall short.
History remembers John as an anomaly, a cautionary tale. But the anomaly is misleading. The true story lies in the machinery that allowed him to exist. The hierarchy of the church, with its rigid obedience, secrecy, and emphasis on protecting authority above all else, provided fertile ground for abuse. The structure didn't cause his desires, but it ensured that there would be no consequences. The system, built to preserve sanctity and the image of divine authority, became a shield behind which predation could flourish. The ripple effects of his actions were profound. Nuns were left shattered, their faith shaken, their sense of self violated. They were trained to obey, to serve, and to protect the sanctity of the church, yet in their obedience, they became victims. The young women who had trusted their spiritual leader found themselves caught in a trap from which there was no escape. Their voices, their pain, their humanity, all systematically erased or dismissed.
Even the church itself was imperiled. Publicly, nothing changed. To the outside world, John was the infallible pope, God's chosen. Privately, however, rumors circulated, fears spread, and the hierarchy worked tirelessly to maintain a facade. Protecting the reputation of the pope became more important than protecting the victims, more important than the truth, more important than morality. Every act of concealment, every denial, every dismissal reinforced the machinery that allowed abuse to thrive. The chronicler's accounts, while fragmented and incomplete, offer a glimpse into the scale of the crisis. Some speak of the nuns who vanished from records, their names forgotten. Others mention the pilgrim women who were lured into the palace under the guise of divine blessing. Few dare to describe the acts themselves, but the fear, the shame, the powerlessness is clear. History recorded the crimes, but it failed to preserve the stories of those who endured them. Their identities, their suffering, and their courage were erased.
John's duality became legend. By day, the sanctified leader of millions; by night, the orchestrator of psychological destruction. He was learning lessons about control that would echo for centuries. He discovered the terrifying efficiency of isolation, manipulation, and fear. He discovered that authority, when unchallenged, can bend reality itself. He discovered that people will protect power over truth, loyalty over justice. And it was not confined to John alone. The system itself was a teacher, instructing future generations in the mechanics of domination. The principles that allowed John to break the wills of nuns and young men would later influence others, those who sought to study power, to control minds, or to exploit trust. The knowledge, once contained within the walls of the Lateran Palace, began to escape. Scholars, chroniclers, and later intelligence agencies would study these techniques, not for morality, but for efficacy.
The Church, despite reforms and advocates for transparency in later centuries, retained its fundamental structure. Power flowed downward. Accountability flowed nowhere. Those at the top possessed extraordinary authority combined with extraordinary immunity from consequences. Even today, the echoes of John's reign remind us that institutional structures, no matter how sacred, can enable unspeakable acts when left unchecked. But history also holds lessons of resilience. The victims, though erased from official records, left traces of their existence. In private letters, fragments of testimony, and whispered stories passed through generations, their humanity survives. Though the Church prioritized its survival over justice, the essence of the abused persisted. These fragments are faint but vital, illuminating a truth that authority cannot erase. Even the most pervasive machinery of power cannot completely silence memory or moral conscience.
In this chapter of history, we see the duality of human institutions, their capacity to create both protection and harm, sanctity and cruelty. We see that corruption is rarely the work of a single individual. It is enabled by structures, hierarchies, and the willingness of people to prioritize self-preservation over truth. John's story is horrifying, but it is also instructive. It teaches us that abuse follows predictable patterns, that power without oversight inevitably harms, and that vigilance is necessary if justice is to survive. The palace continues to stand, its walls unchanged by centuries of scrutiny. Marble corridors echo with footsteps that are no longer there. Shadows play across empty chambers, and the machinery of authority hums quietly, awaiting its next test. John's reign is centuries past, but the principles remain. The story recorded in fragments and whispers is not merely historical, it is a warning, a blueprint for recognizing patterns, and a testament to the resilience of those who refuse to be erased. History has a habit of forgetting names, dates, and events, but the essence of what happened within the Lateran Palace cannot be entirely suppressed. It persists in the shadows, in the strategies of power, and in the stories of the victims whose voices, though silenced, demand remembrance. Understanding this history is not an academic exercise. It is a moral imperative. It is a call to recognize, resist, and remember.
And so, as John's name faded from the narrative of power, the machinery he perfected lived on. Not just in the Vatican, but wherever human hierarchy, unchecked authority, and immunity from accountability exist. Rome sleeps outside, but inside the palace, the lessons of history echo, waiting for those who dare to see, to question, and to remember.
The human mind is a labyrinth. In some corners, light and understanding guide the way. In others, shadows twist perception, memory, and self-worth. For John's victims, the nuns, the pilgrims, the young women who trusted in the sanctity of the Church, those shadows were not accidental. They were deliberate. Every word, every gesture, every command from the young pope was a tool, a mechanism of control. It begins subtly, a compliment that feels warm at first, then laced with obligation, a request that seems innocuous until refusing it feels impossible. The victims, trained in obedience and reverence, were particularly vulnerable. They had been taught that authority is holy, that disobedience is sin. John exploited this training with precision. One moment he was blessing them. The next, he was asserting a power so absolute it erased their agency. Isolation became a weapon. Nuns were moved to different wings of the palace, separated from mentors, from friends, from anyone who could provide counsel or comfort.
Pilgrims found themselves cut off from familiar faces, dependent entirely on those who held authority over their every move. In such an environment, even small decisions became impossible. Every choice was filtered through fear and uncertainty, every thought second-guessed. The mind begins to fracture, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Coercion followed swiftly. John was learning, experimenting, testing the limits of compliance. The nuns, the pilgrims, and even the young men he targeted were subjected to a system of psychological manipulation that was both ancient and, for its time, horrifyingly innovative. Flattery and charm alternated with intimidation and unpredictability. Praise and condemnation arrived in such rapid succession that victims could no longer trust their own judgments or perceptions. Every interaction reinforced the message, "You exist to serve," and resistance is not just futile, it is unthinkable. The human spirit, however, is not entirely powerless. The victims found themselves balancing the impossible, a deep-rooted sense of morality against the instinct to survive. They learned to obey, to hide pain, to endure, to compartmentalize suffering. And in that endurance, a strange resilience emerged, a flicker of resistance even in the darkest corridors of the Lateran Palace. John, for his part, was fascinated. He observed how easily a human mind could bend when authority was absolute. He studied reactions, measured responses, and refined techniques that would become hallmarks of systematic abuse. Sleep deprivation, manipulation of trust, the strategic use of secrecy, all were tools he wielded. In some ways, the Vatican became a laboratory for the mechanics of domination, and the lessons learned here would not stay confined to Rome or the 15th century. They would echo through time in various forms, wherever power seeks to crush dissent or independence. The chroniclers who attempted to record these abuses struggled with more than just moral outrage. They struggled with comprehension. How could one document the psychological erosion of a soul? How could words capture the fear that arises when obedience is rewarded only when it leads to further submission? Historical accounts describe faint echoes of despair, a nun's tears in a candlelit chapel, a pilgrim's silent prayers for escape, a young man's trembling when a simple glance from John could dictate his fate. Yet these accounts were fragmented. Names were often omitted. Stories were compressed, erased, or reframed. The machinery of power did not end with the Pope. It extended to those who wrote history. Even today, psychologists study the methods John employed, knowingly or not. Coercive control, manipulation, and the systematic breaking of will have modern names and academic frameworks. But the principles remain consistent: isolation, unpredictability, power imbalance, and emotional exploitation. The techniques used within the walls of the Lateran Palace are the same as those used in abusive relationships, cults, and even governmental interrogations centuries later. The pattern is universal because it is human. Power, unchecked, becomes a weapon against the powerless. Yet amid the fear and subjugation, acts of courage emerged. Small resistances, a whispered defiance, a hidden prayer, a subtle refusal represented the undying flicker of human dignity. These acts, while seeming minor, were radical. They challenged the narrative that absolute authority is unassailable. They became seeds of remembrance, proof that even in a place designed to erase identity, individuals retained fragments of self. The duality of John's victims is striking. On one hand, they were broken in ways that history may never fully capture. On the other, they displayed a profound resilience that no hierarchy could entirely destroy. The human mind, even under relentless manipulation, retains the capacity for memory, for reflection, and for moral judgment. These survivors, though silenced, carried within themselves the proof that the machinery of power cannot entirely obliterate humanity. The palace itself mirrored this duality. Marble corridors and grand halls offered both sanctuary and prison. Candles flickered across frescoed ceilings depicting saints and angels, a stark contrast to the unseen horrors unfolding below. Every ritual, every sacred ceremony became entangled with deception, creating a tension between outward holiness and inner corruption. The cognitive dissonance for both victims and perpetrators was immense, and it was precisely this tension that allowed the machinery to function so efficiently. By the time John reached the height of his manipulations, he had perfected a terrifying symmetry. Authority was absolute. Accountability was non-existent. The nuns and pilgrims were broken in ways invisible to the eye, but indelibly marked in the psyche. The Church's reputation remained untarnished externally, though internally, the corridors of power were steeped in fear, silence, and complicity. This chapter in history is crucial because it teaches a painful truth. Systems designed to concentrate power and suppress accountability do not simply allow abuse, they facilitate it. Understanding the mechanisms of coercion is not an academic exercise, it is a survival tool. Recognizing the signs, the isolation, the manipulation, the silencing of voices is the first step toward resistance. And as history shows, resistance, even in the faintest form, can persist and echo through generations. The shadows of the mind once cast by John's reign extend far beyond the palace walls. They are reflected in patterns of abuse that recur in institutions, families, and societies. They remind us that vigilance is necessary, that moral courage is required, and that memory is an act of defiance. The nuns, pilgrims, and young men who endured John's manipulations left traces not in official records, but in the lessons they imparted to history. Power without accountability is destructive, and the human spirit, while fragile, cannot be completely extinguished.
In the end, the Lateran Palace stands as both monument and warning. Its grandeur belies the suffering within. Its corridors echo with stories of fear and courage, of manipulation and quiet rebellion. Understanding the psychological machinery that John wielded is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity. It is a guide to recognizing patterns, protecting the vulnerable, and honoring those whose names have been erased.
The Lateran Palace, grand and imposing, was more than just stone and marble. It was a stage upon which human desire, ambition, and cruelty collided. Beyond the ceremonies, the blessings, and the solemn rituals, another world existed, one of secrecy, manipulation, and forbidden pleasures. John, barely 18, had begun to explore the limits of his authority in ways that history would struggle to define. His victims were no longer just nuns or pilgrims. They now included young men, drawn by coercion, seduction, or fear. In a society bound tightly by rules and dogma, these male victims were especially vulnerable. The very nature of their abuse made acknowledgement almost impossible. A confession could destroy them socially, spiritually, and politically. Within the palace walls, John wielded a power so absolute that any refusal or complaint carried consequences far beyond physical punishment. It threatened identity, belonging, and survival itself. It started subtly, as many forms of coercion do. A lingering glance in a dimly lit corridor, a casual touch that lingered longer than propriety allowed, a command framed as a request from God's representative. Those who resisted were isolated, shamed, or reassigned, cutting them off from any support network. Those who complied found themselves trapped in a cycle of obligation, guilt, and terror that was impossible to escape. John's orgies, whispered about in the shadows, were not mere indulgences, they were exercises in control. Each encounter was calculated to erode autonomy and assert dominance. The participants, both willing and unwilling, were subjected to a psychological rigor that mirrored the methods he had already perfected on his female victims. Praise and condemnation were tools, unpredictability a weapon, and secrecy the bloodline of the operation. The palace itself seemed to conspire, with hidden chambers, private corridors, and loyal attendants ensuring that nothing was observed by those outside the Pope's inner circle. The chroniclers of the time struggled to describe what was happening. They stumbled over language, morality, and categorization, unsure how to frame the unnatural mixture of divinity and depravity. Some accounts hint at gay orgies, at coercion masked as consent, at fear disguised as devotion. Others note the confusion and shame of those involved. Yet the records are fragmented, partial, and often sanitized to protect the Church's image. Names were left out, identities were erased, suffering was compressed into mere anecdotes or vague warnings about excess and vice. The psychological toll on victims was immense. Beyond fear and shame, there was an internal conflict between self-preservation and morality, between loyalty to the institution and the instinct to escape harm. Many attempted to rationalize, to find excuses for the Pope's behavior, because admitting the truth could destroy them. Others descended into despair, feeling trapped in a system where resistance seemed futile. The palace became both a prison and the psychological battlefield. For John, the thrill of exercising unchecked power was intoxicating. He observed reactions, measured compliance, and learned which techniques elicit obedience or fear. He experimented with manipulation, discovering that vulnerability could be exploited in predictable ways. Sleep deprivation, isolation, and constant scrutiny became tools, wielded to create confusion and dependence. By breaking the will of his victims without leaving physical marks, he perfected a form of control that was invisible to outsiders, yet devastating to those inside. The political consequences were equally complex. Rumors spread through the Vatican corridors, whispers of impropriety, murmurs of scandal. Yet the institution itself was designed to protect the Pope, not the victims. Advisors, cardinals, and attendants found themselves caught between moral intuition and survival. Speaking out risked not only careers, but lives. Loyalty to the hierarchy often outweighed conscience, ensuring that the machinery of protection for John continued unbroken. The broader implications were stark. The Vatican, which had once positioned itself as a moral authority, now housed one of history's most systematic abuses of power. The internal contradictions were impossible to reconcile. The spiritual leader was also the predator. The sacred halls were also a laboratory of coercion. And yet the palace's grandeur and the Church's authority provided cover, ensuring that most abuses remained invisible to the world outside its walls. History rarely remembers the victims. The male victims, like the female, were erased from records. Their suffering was rendered invisible, their names omitted. Yet their experiences were part of the same machinery, the machinery of absolute power, unchecked authority, and institutional preservation. Understanding their plight is essential because it exposes the universality of coercion and the ways in which hierarchies can exploit human vulnerability.
Psychologists today recognize the same patterns: coercive control, manipulation, isolation, and the erasure of identity. These are not relics of the 15th century. They are ongoing phenomena wherever power flows downward without accountability. By studying John's methods, modern observers can trace the origins of abusive strategies that persist in institutions, relationships, and governments. The lessons are chilling. Unchecked authority leads not just to moral corruption, but to systematic exploitation. And yet, amid the darkness, there were moments of quiet defiance. Victims found small ways to resist: hidden letters, whispered prayers, subtle refusals, or acts of solidarity with one another. These tiny acts of rebellion, though often invisible to history, represented the indomitable human spirit. They proved that even in environments designed to erase identity and autonomy, fragments of resistance survived. These acts of courage, however small, were crucial. They carried the memory of truth forward, ensuring that the machinery of abuse, however sophisticated, could not entirely obliterate humanity. By the end of his reign, John had mastered the machinery of control. He had exploited vulnerabilities, manipulated obedience, and created fear that extended far beyond the palace walls. The Lateran Palace, grand and holy to the outside world, was in truth a crucible of psychological manipulation, coercion, and erasure. The victim's suffering, largely hidden from public record, was real, profound, and enduring. The story of John's abuse extends beyond historical curiosity. It is a lesson in human psychology, institutional failure, and the enduring consequences of unchecked power. It reminds us that secrecy and hierarchy, when combined, can produce mechanisms of harm that are both invisible and devastating. It warns us that institutions, no matter how sacred or venerable, are vulnerable to corruption when authority is absolute and accountability absent. Most importantly, it teaches a moral imperative: to observe, to question, and to remember. The victims' voices, though silenced for centuries, matter. Their stories, reconstructed through fragments, offer insight into the machinery of power and the resilience of the human spirit. And their experiences serve as a warning that unchecked authority, if left unchallenged, will inevitably be used to dominate, manipulate, and erase those without power. The shadows of the Lateran Palace stretch far beyond its walls. They are visible in any institution where hierarchy suppresses accountability, in any environment where reputation is prioritized over justice, and in any system that seeks to erase the voices of the vulnerable. By understanding what happened within the palace, by acknowledging the hidden suffering, we equip ourselves to recognize, resist, and prevent the reoccurrence of such abuses. History may have tried to forget, but memory persists. The names of the victims may be lost, but the lessons endure. The machinery of abuse that John perfected continues in forms both subtle and overt, reminding us that power, when left unchecked, is never benign. And in recognizing this, we honor those who suffered by refusing to let their experiences vanish into silence.
The Lateran Palace was more than just a residence or a center of worship. It was a fortress, not only of stone and marble, but of secrecy, privilege, and protection. Every corridor, every hidden chamber, every flickering candle played a part in shielding those at the top from scrutiny. And at the top, of course, was John, the Pope. At 18, he wielded authority over an entire church, yet he was surrounded by layers of advisors, cardinals, and attendants whose loyalty was as absolute as it was carefully maintained. Rumors began to spread almost immediately after John's ascent to the papacy. Whispers of misconduct floated through the corridors like smoke, reaching ears that were trained to hear without speaking. Some murmurs suggested moral failings,
Others hinted at sexual impropriety, but all were treated with caution. Within the church, reputation was everything. The Pope's moral authority had to appear untouchable. The machinery of the institution had to function smoothly, lest cracks become visible to the outside world. The church's response was simple, consistent, and terrifyingly effective. Silence, deflection, and loyalty to the system. Advisors counseled discretion. Cardinals swore obedience. Attendants and clerks maintained the illusion of divine order. No one dared speak publicly, and those who might have considered doing so quickly realized the cost. Careers, status, and even personal safety were wrapped tightly around the institution's survival. Speaking truth in such a system was not only dangerous, it was nearly impossible. John, aware of this protective bubble, learned to exploit it. He observed the hierarchy, understood the incentives, and pushed boundaries incrementally. Each act of coercion or abuse became easier, each manipulation more refined because the institution itself provided cover. It wasn't just his personal power that protected him. It was the church's structural commitment to self-preservation. Protect the Pope at all costs. Questioning the Pope meant questioning the church. Questioning the church was unthinkable. Victims quickly learned the same lesson. Complaints were discouraged, whispers dismissed, and letters of concern intercepted or ignored. A nun or a servant could try to voice fear, shame, or opposition, but the system was designed to absorb such attempts and neutralize them. Fear became a powerful tool. Fear of punishment, fear of ostracization, fear of divine wrath. Every mechanism of the institution reinforced compliance and discouraged resistance. The tension between faith and authority became unbearable for many. Belief in God, which should have provided comfort and moral clarity, became a source of confusion. How could the representative of God commit such acts? How could the sacred hierarchy condone, conceal, or ignore them? Those who struggled with these questions were often left alone in their doubt, forced to navigate moral dilemmas with no guidance, no support, and no hope of resolution. Meanwhile, John's behavior grew bolder. What started as secret encounters evolved into organized exploitation, orchestrated in ways that ensured the institution remained shielded. He observed reactions, anticipated compliance, and perfected his manipulation. Psychological tactics learned and refined over centuries within the corridors of power were applied with precision. Fear, seduction, and isolation worked in concert to break resistance. By controlling both his environment and the perception of those around him, John turned the palace into a laboratory of domination. The church, paradoxically, had created the conditions for this abuse long before John arrived. A rigid hierarchy, centralized authority, and the unassailable reputation of the Pope meant that any act of misconduct could be concealed. The very structure that ensured the church's survival also enabled its moral corruption. Individuals might have been complicit, but the system itself was the true enabler, incentivizing silence and punishing accountability. Historians looking back struggle to comprehend the scale of this failure. They note the contradictions. A spiritual institution meant to guide morality and protect the vulnerable, instead becoming a mechanism for concealment. Documents that survive often obscure the reality, framing scandal in vague, euphemistic language or erasing evidence entirely. Those who suffered remain unnamed. The machinery of institutional preservation left them invisible. Yet even in such an environment, cracks appeared. Certain observers within the church felt unease, moral discomfort that could not be fully suppressed. Some cardinals wrestled with conscience. Some attendants glimpsed the humanity of the victims. Small acts of defiance, tiny deviations from total obedience, hinted that even the most impenetrable walls could be challenged. But the system was resilient, its incentives strong, and these moments rarely grew into anything capable of stopping the Pope's abuses.
The lessons extend beyond history. Any institution that prioritizes self-preservation over justice, reputation over truth, and hierarchy over accountability will inevitably create conditions for abuse. Governments, corporations, militaries, universities, they all reflect the same structural risks. The Lateran Palace was not unique. What was unique was the combination of absolute power, secrecy, and moral authority concentrated in the hands of one individual, and the system's willingness to protect that individual at all costs. For John, the walls that protected him also became a mirror. He could see his actions reflected not only in his own mind, but in the institution itself. The church's willingness to shield him allowed him to act without fear of consequence. Its structure encouraged the exploitation of trust, authority, and devotion, and in turn, he began to see the institution itself as malleable, a tool to be shaped to his desires rather than a moral framework to guide behavior. The victims, meanwhile, lived in perpetual tension. They were trapped between fear and faith, coercion and conscience, obedience and survival. Their daily lives became exercises of psychological endurance, navigating a palace designed not for their protection, but for their erasure. And yet, even in this oppression, they found ways to maintain their identity, to preserve fragments of autonomy, and to resist invisibility. By the end of John's papacy, it was clear that the Lateran Palace's grandeur was a facade. Beneath the marble floors, behind the flickering candles, a system of silence and protection had been perfected. The institution had survived, but at what cost? The moral credibility of the church was compromised, victims were erased, and the knowledge of systematic abuse was preserved for future generations. This chapter of history reminds us that power without accountability is never benign. Institutions, no matter how sacred or venerable, are vulnerable to corruption when the protection of authority is prioritized over justice. And in understanding this, we see the enduring relevance of John's story, a warning that structures designed to protect the powerful can do so at the expense of truth, morality, and humanity. Even centuries later, the lessons remain. The walls that shield the powerful still exist, and those who inhabit them often act with the same patterns of control, concealment, and self-preservation. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward resisting them. Listening to the victims, honoring their experiences, and refusing to let history be rewritten are acts of moral responsibility that transcend time, culture, and circumstance. The Lateran Palace, magnificent and solemn, continues to stand as both a monument and a warning. Grandeur can conceal cruelty, authority can obscure truth, and institutions that value survival over justice will always produce victims. Memory, attention, and vigilance are the tools we have to prevent history from repeating itself.
The corridors of the Lateran Palace were silent once more, but the echoes of what had occurred within its walls would not fade. John's reign, though centuries ago, left a legacy far more enduring than any decree or sermon. It was a legacy written not in ink or marble, but in the quiet terror of those who had survived his manipulations, and in the invisible mechanisms that continued to shape institutions long after he was gone. John's power had been absolute, his authority unquestionable. He had learned to exploit the very structure designed to safeguard morality, turning the church's hierarchy into a shield that protected his desires and silenced opposition. But the knowledge of his methods did not disappear with him. Instead, it became part of a broader understanding of how power can be weaponized against the vulnerable. The principles were simple, yet terrifying: isolation, psychological manipulation, exploitation of trust, and the use of institutional structures to suppress truth. These techniques, perfected in the corridors of the Vatican, traveled far beyond the palace.
Cults studied them and adapted them to control new recruits. Intelligence agencies formalized them for interrogation, and abusers in private life applied them in ways that left no physical marks, yet shattered their victims' autonomy. John's methods became a blueprint, not merely for cruelty, but for the systematic control of human behavior. Understanding this legacy is uncomfortable because it reminds us that the machinery of abuse is not limited to the past, nor confined to one institution. Yet to fully grasp the scope of this legacy, we must return to the victims, the nuns, servants, and pilgrims whose lives were twisted by John's actions were more than statistics or nameless figures in dusty chronicles. They were humans with resilience, fear, and the capacity for memory. Even when their voices were erased by an institution determined to preserve its reputation, fragments of their experiences persisted in whispers, letters, and historical anomalies. These fragments are crucial. They remind us that the human cost of absolute power is never abstract, it is personal, and it is profound. In modern times, institutions often repeat the same mistakes. Governments, corporations, universities, and religious organizations all mirror the structure that allowed John to act without consequence. Centralized authority, immunity for those at the top, and an unyielding emphasis on self-preservation. Wherever these elements combine, abuse follows. Recognizing this pattern is essential to preventing it. The story of John, horrifying as it is, serves as a warning. Power without accountability is never neutral. It will always find a way to exploit the vulnerable. But there is hope in understanding. Knowledge of these mechanisms allows us to resist them. Historical accounts, survivor testimonies, and the painstaking work of researchers provide the tools to identify abuse, challenge authority, and prioritize truth over reputation. Each act of recognition, each refusal to accept silence, becomes a shield against the machinery that John once exemplified. Memory itself is an act of defiance, a refusal to allow erasure. Even more, John's story illustrates the complexity of human psychology under extreme conditions. He was not merely a villain. He was a product of a system that rewarded coercion and punished dissent. This does not excuse his actions, but it illuminates the broader truth about how institutions shape behavior. It is a reminder that systemic reform, changing structures of power, creating accountability, and empowering the vulnerable is just as important as moral condemnation. The lessons extend beyond historical analysis. When we see patterns of silence, protection of the powerful, and erasure of victims in contemporary settings, we are witnessing the same principles that operated in the Lateran Palace. Each scandal, each instance of cover-up, is a reflection of centuries of institutional design. But each revelation, each act of speaking out, is a chance to alter that design, to create structures that prioritize humanity over hierarchy, justice over reputation, and truth over preservation. John's story also challenges us to examine memory and history. For centuries, the voices of his victims were erased, and yet through the diligence of historians and the fragments that survived, the truth emerged. This is a lesson in persistence. No system, no matter how powerful, can fully suppress memory. History remembers those who are often overlooked, even if their names are lost, even if the details are incomplete. And as long as we choose to remember, as long as we tell these stories, we resist the machinery of erasure. The shadows of John's reign are still visible today. Psychological manipulation, abuse of authority, and institutional concealment continue to exist, but understanding the mechanisms allows society to act differently. It allows people to recognize patterns, support victims, and challenge systems that protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Each act of awareness, each refusal to comply with silence, is a continuation of the struggle to prevent history from repeating itself.
Ultimately, the legacy of John and the Lateran Palace is a dual lesson. On one hand, it is a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority, the insidiousness of institutional protection, and the human capacity for cruelty when structures encourage it. On the other hand, it is a testament to the endurance of truth and memory, the possibility that even in the face of overwhelming power, justice can emerge, stories can be told, and victims can be honored. The world outside the Vatican has changed, yet the fundamental principles remain. Hierarchies exist, power consolidates, and institutions sometimes protect the wrong people. But each individual, each witness, each historian, each advocate has the ability to intervene. Knowledge, vigilance, and moral courage are the tools that can prevent the repetition of John's machinery. Memory becomes resistance, and truth becomes the ultimate safeguard. In the end, John's story is not just a tale of one man's corruption. It is a mirror held up to every institution, every hierarchy, and every system where power goes unchecked. It is a call to remember, to witness, and to act. And as long as we do, the shadows cast by history will not be allowed to engulf the present. The Lateran Palace, silent yet enduring, continues to teach. Its walls may protect the powerful, but they cannot erase memory, suppress truth, or stop those who choose to see, remember, and resist. John's legacy, horrifying as it is, becomes a beacon for understanding and challenging the machinery of abuse in every age.